Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the unveiling of the legislative agenda for the Community College National Legislative Summit for 2024. My name is Carrie Warwick-Smith, and I am the Vice President for Public Policy at the Association of Community College Trustees. Next slide, please. Today, I am joined by colleague David Boehm, Senior Vice President, Government Relations at the American Association of Community Colleges, as well as my ACCT colleagues, Jose Miranda and Rosario Duran. Today, we have an agenda to share, and we are very excited to have all of you joining us at the National Legislative Summit. We're going to open with a recap of the 118th Congress. So we're just about midway through that Congress. So we'll talk about what's happened over the last year very briefly. We will give an overview of our legislative priorities. So this is your green sheet preview as you get ready for your meetings at NLS the first weekend in February. And then we will have time for question and answer, as well as a few reminders for the event. We are excited to have approximately 1,200 community college leaders joining us in February. So we should have a really strong representation for our colleges and for our students here in the Capitol. And with that, I am going to turn it over to start the program to Rosario. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to dive right into the recap of the 118th Congress thus far. So to say that the 2023 was marked with a lot of political curveballs is putting it mildly, definitely. We started the year off knowing that it was going to be an uphill battle with a divided government and razor-thin majorities in both chambers of Congress. As you'll recall, we had a 2-seat majority in the Senate and a 9-seat majority in the House. But even for a divided government, the political challenges we faced were largely unprecedented, and it made it very difficult for policymakers to actually pass legislation. So since the onset, the House took 15 ballots to select the Speaker, and it required former Speaker McCarthy to make substantial concessions to his right flank and get the gavel. These concessions, in hindsight, give a lot of influence to a handful of representatives, and they were not afraid to use it. It led to hyperpartisan bills with no real chance of becoming law, and as Jose will expand on later, very little movement on the appropriations front. So then last fall, Speaker McCarthy was ousted through a motion to vacate, and that left the House without a speaker for 3 weeks. Ultimately, that led to the election of Speaker Mike Johnson from Louisiana. And with all of that happening, there was very little actually legislate. This led to only 20 bills being signed into law in 2023 and marking the least productive Congress in recent history. 2024, where does that leave us? As you know, 2024 is a presidential election year, and we will definitely see more gridlock as members of Congress hope to heighten their profiles ahead of primaries, and especially leading into the general elections. Congress will generally shift more into campaign mode starting early summer, which means there's going to be less time scheduled for votes. And this also heightens the importance of our advocacy efforts now. And it means members of Congress will be eager to connect with their constituents and local stakeholders when they head home. With such thin majorities in each chamber, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, both of them are up for grabs this election cycle. So the House is currently sitting on a 5-seat majority, and the Senate still has a 2-seat majority. We're going to continue to monitor these developments and how they'll impact our priorities. With that, now to kick off our legislative priorities overview. Sorry, Jose, you're on mute.
Thank you, Rosario. Sorry, I was trying to figure this out. Had a bit of a technical glitch. You would think we'd be done with those 3 years after the pandemic happened and we had to transition to webinars. So real quick, as Rosario mentioned, this past year, the first year of the 118th Congress was one of the least productive we've seen, even by Congress standards. And what that means is that many of the items that we have been working really hard to accomplish over the past year are still on the table and are still a work in progress. So you'll notice that many of the items on the green sheet may sound familiar if you were with us last year, and that is because we are still trying to get Congress to get us to the finish line of many of these issues. So we'll start off with funding key education and workforce programs. As you all know, part of a big reason of why Speaker McCarthy was ousted in the first place was his inability to get his caucus on the same page in terms of appropriations. We avoided as a nation debt defaulting on our debt last year as a result of a compromise between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy that set funding levels for fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. However, the vocal minority of his caucus was not happy with those funding levels and pushed for steeper cuts, which the House proceeded to draft many of those bills at significantly lower levels than what was agreed on in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Eventually, that led to gridlock going into September 30th, which ultimately resulted in what we've seen is the norm these days, which is a continuing resolution to allow Congress more time. Part of this was not something that the vocal minority liked, and as Congress, as Rosario mentioned, it led to his ouster, and the new speaker, Speaker Johnson, now has had to pick up the pieces. But what that means is that we're still sort of in the same page. There's been some progress over the last month, but there is still a vocal minority in the House that does not like the agreed funding levels. Senator Schumer and Speaker Johnson agreed on new funding levels, which are largely the same as the ones that were agreed upon last spring between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy, with some differences on the pay-fors, on how they balance out the budget sheet. But the funding levels are largely the same. The folks that were unhappy last year are still unhappy this year, but it seems like Speaker Johnson has a little bit of more credibility within its caucus to move forward, knowing that they are running out of time, and this is a critical issue. So what this all means for us is that, largely speaking, we're not looking at large increases across the board for educational programs. In fact, we're probably fighting to keep level funding for many of our programs. Many of the programs that we like, such as C Campus, were proposed to be cut by the House bill. The Senate has level funded many things, has slight increases others, but the Senate proposal is also higher than what was agreed on by Senator Schumer and Speaker Johnson. So there's going to be a lot of working on that. In terms of our key priorities that we're gonna continue focusing is, we want to maintain and enhance the Pell Grant. The House proposed to level fund the maximum award of the Pell Grant, and the Senate proposed a modest $200 increase. I say modest because compared to some of previous years where we saw $500 increases, it's not as large as we'd like it to be. But we also know that a level funding of the maximum award of the Pell is essentially a cut, given rising inflation and the loss of purchasing power. So we're going to be aiming for, at a minimum, that $200 increase that the Senate has proposed. Other areas that we're going to keep a close eye on, and we're going to continue asking you all to share with your lawmakers, is all the various other student support programs that your institutions utilize to benefit students, such as the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grants and Federal Work Study, both of which programs were proposed for elimination in the House bill. C Campus, which, as I mentioned, was also proposed for elimination. And then some of those longstanding and newer programs that we've seen over the last couple of years, such as TRIO, post-secondary student success, and basic needs for post-secondary students as well. On the institutional side, we continue advocating for resources to our institutions, particularly strengthening institutions program, Title III-A, which is currently proposed to be level funded in both bills. So that's probably best case scenario, but we're going to continue advocating for the need for additional money, as well as increasing investments in our workforce pipeline, namely the strengthening community college training grants, which for this program in particular, the House and the Senate flipped. The House proposes to level fund it, and the Senate proposed to have a small $5 million cut. So we don't want to see any cuts, of course. If we had to choose, we'd rather see it level funded rather than a cut. But in a base case scenario, we would like to see that $5 million be an increase rather than a decrease. Next slide. And then with this, I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Who also started talking while on mute because yeah, I'm still remembering that as well. So thank you, Jose, for going through all of our appropriations priorities. With the a likely extension again of our fiscal year 24 continuing resolutions, NLS is really well timed, where Congress is going to be thinking about fiscal year 24, then immediately going into fiscal year 25, but also has active legislation on some of our other top priorities as well. So it's going to be a well-timed and busy first week in February. So two groups of legislation to talk about here under the workforce banner. The first is workforce Pell Grants. As anyone who's been to NLS before knows, short-term Pell is a topic that we've been talking about for several years in a row and continues to be one of our top priorities. In the 118th Congress, it's had a bit of a rebrand, and it is now generally referred to as workforce Pell. But it is really the same concept of Pell Grant programs that are the availability of the Pell Grant for programs that are 150 clock hours or up to 600 clock hours and offered between 8 and 15 weeks. So there has been a number of pieces of legislation over the past year that have been introduced, including the Jobs Act, which both ACCT and AACC have supported for several Congresses now. That version of the bill is both bipartisan and bicameral. But this year, for the first time, we also saw some additional bills. The Pell Act from Representative Fox in the House and Senator Braun introduced, excuse me, not Senator Braun, Senator Budd introduced that in the Senate. And then Representative Scott, the ranking member on the House Education and Workforce Committee, introduced the Workforce Pell for Jobs Act. And then because we had the leaders in the House committee both introducing their own bills, they actually decided to come together and negotiate a bipartisan workforce Pell bill, which they have now introduced with Representatives Stefanik and DeSaulnier joining them. So we now have really two primary bipartisan bills that are going to be the topic of conversation when you are all here in February, one being the Jobs Act and the second being the bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, which is bipartisan but currently in the House only. So just a quick few highlights on that new bill, that bipartisan Workforce Pell bill that's led by, that includes the leaders of the House Education and Workforce Committee. The program eligibility that I mentioned is pretty much the same across all bills. The difference with all of the House bills, except the Jobs Act, is that it includes proprietary institutions in the eligibility requirements. Additionally, The Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act also includes online programs as long as they are able to meet all other requirements. And pretty much all of the bills also require any programs participating to have been in existence for 1 year prior being considered for eligibility. Across many of the bills, there are a variety of evaluation measures proposed, and the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act really takes the approach of the more the merrier, and includes requirements for the State Workforce Assessment Board, the accreditor, the recognized accreditor, and the Department of Ed to each have different pieces of data and elements that they must verify or approve in order for a program to be eligible. So those programs will have to meet several high bars in order to be able to participate. So that's really kind of where the playing field stands on the workforce Pell front. I expect when you go into your meetings that you will hear a lot about this, about the variety of the bills, and really our general message here, which we'll go in to a little more deeply at NLS during the priority session, is that this is really the time for Congress to act on this. We have so much support from all sides that it's really time for them to work out the details and move forward on this. And then second, Representatives Fox and Scott were very busy at the end of last calendar year introducing bipartisan legislation. They introduced a bipartisan reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was last reauthorized in 2014, so is certainly past due and time for renewal. Kind of the top line on this bill is that they're really working to streamline the process, and they haven't really added any new money to the bill. So there have been, a lot of discussions about whether or not the amounts authorized should be increased. But as we mentioned, this is a bipartisan bill, so there was some give and take in order to get everyone on both sides of the aisle on board. Kind of the biggest change that we're really paying attention to is the treatment of the fees that are generated from the H-1B visas. Employers, as you know, pay these fees in order to hire H-1B workers from other countries. But in the past, each Department of Labor, so each administration, really had the ability to decide how that funding was used or would be used during their time. And there's now a shift in this new piece of legislation, proposed legislation, where Congress will really be dictating how the Department of Labor is able to use those funds. So that's, again, an area that we are examining and we'll dive into more deeply when we get to the priority session at NLS. But, in general, we at both organizations did a reply letter when that legislation was introduced. So that's something that we can share out or you can find on either of our websites to see, our really detailed reaction, which is generally positive, but we did make some recommendations as well. And we are looking forward to seeing whether the Senate takes this up or introduces their own bill, and we'll continue working with both legislatures on this reauthorization of the WIOA Act. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk about taxes.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks everybody for being with us this afternoon and for coming to Washington in a couple of weeks to help us advocate on our priorities. Just to build a little bit on what Carrie just mentioned about the workforce Pell, our community has done an incredible amount of lobbying and very effective persuasion of members of Congress to support that legislation. We do have bipartisan support in both chambers and bipartisan bills with Republicans and Democrats on the bills. And as Carrie said, this is the year where we really want to get this done. We think we can get this done. as Carrie outlined, or Rosario, excuse me, at the beginning, we have a very unproductive Congress so far. Probably is not going to change in this election year. This is a piece of legislation that might actually go, and the members could feel good about talking to their constituents about. So we're really looking forward to doing a big push on the workforce Pell with you working with us here in DC. So I just wanted to reiterate that. In terms of the tax issues, those of you who've been with us before will be familiar with this issue. Like Workforce Pell, it's one that we have worked on for some time. We've faced challenges, not so much of the same nature as Workforce Pell, where there have been some very real policy differences between various parties, and some of those policy differences remain, as Carrie mentioned, in terms of the for-profit institutions. But in terms of this tax legislation, it's just very hard to find suitable vehicles to move tax bills. And there are just an awfully lot of players and interests that are jockeying for what amounts to expenditures on behalf of whatever it is their particular interest is as tax bills move forward. However, having said that, since last February, we have made an incredible amount of progress in both the House and the Senate in the form of the introduction of bills in each chamber by members of the tax writing committees, Finance and Ways and Means in the House. And we will be providing you with the details of those bills when you come to town and on the green sheet, as we call it. But just know that the primary goal that we have here is to end the taxation of the Pell Grant for our students. All the amounts that they receive for anything that goes beyond tuition and required fees are subject to taxation, and many of our students do, and their families do pay taxes on the Pell received, which we think is bad policy, and we think it stands in the way of student success. And we also think it just doesn't really make much sense to provide a need-based grant and then in one form and then take the money away to the tax code in another. So we're working on that, and that's included in these bipartisan bills that I just mentioned. And then the other component of that bill is relates to the way that the Pell Grant is treated for the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is $2,500 that many students receive. Essentially, if a filer has income of less than $160,000 a year, so way up the income scale, they can qualify for this credit if the student is enrolled half-time or more. It turns out that because of the low tuitions that community college students pay, and because of the fact that when you receive a Pell Grant, that money is counted against your tuition, that because of the way the formula works for the American Opportunity Tax Credit is that the bulk of our Pell Grant recipients don't receive this $2,500. And when you consider that, as I mentioned, that you have a family that has $160,000 in income in a given year and can afford a much higher tuition than community college is charged, that family receives the $2,500. And we think that that too is an inequitable and unfair policy that works against the neediest students succeeding in college. I mean, they're the students who need the resources the most. So finally, in the tax area, just to mention that there is a tax bill that is coming to fruition really as we speak, that we have worked to try to get the Tax-Free Pell Grant Act included into. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, but it might yet happen because of all the backroom machinations of the tax writers and the very real desire of some of our champions on this legislation to get this done through this bill. The tax bill that is going to be moved is relatively limited in scope. Just by means of comparison, it's estimated to be about a $78 billion bill. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act bill that was signed into law by President Trump in 2017 was a $2.3 trillion measure. So in other words, it was almost 30 times as large as this bill that is hopefully going to be moving in Congress in the coming days. We will have more timely information for you about exactly the parliamentary status of the legislation, as well as what you can do to advocate for it when you're here. Probably that's going to take the form of asking you to ask your members of Congress to formally co-sponsor the legislation. So with that as an overview of the tax situation, I'll turn things over to Jose. Are you going to talk about the DREAM Act legislation?
Rosario will take this one.
Thanks. Thanks, David. So currently community colleges educate thousands of dreamers striving for a higher education, and providing a pathway to citizenship for dreamers and DACA recipients has long been a priority for community colleges. To provide some background, the DACA program, which allows dreamers to receive a work permit and bars them from deportation, was established by President Obama in 2012 through a presidential memorandum. And since its establishment, the program has faced several legal challenges. In 2022, a U.S. Court of Appeals upheld a ruling that stated the process in which the Obama administration created the DACA program was unlawful. And since that ruling, all new applications for the DACA program have not been processed. They're no longer being processed. And anyone that already had DACA status and was a DACA recipient, they're still able to renew their status. So this led the Biden administration to try to strengthen the DACA program by going through the rules-making process and establishing DACA through an official department rule. Unsurprisingly, this new rule was challenged in court, and last September, DACA was ruled against by a district court. So what's next for DACA? Litigation-wise, the case's odds don't look so great, since the case will face the same U.S. appeals court that previously struck it down. Beyond the appeals court, the case could go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's likely to face similar prospects there. It seems that a legislative solution is the only way forward for millions of dreamers, and that requires action from Congress. To that end, we have again endorsed the DREAM Act this Congress, which would provide a permanent solution for dreamers. And in the Senate, it's called the DREAM Act, and it's been introduced on a bipartisan basis by Senator Durbin and Graham. And in the House, it's called the American Dream and Promise Act, and that's been introduced by Representative Sylvia Garcia, and it also has bipartisan support. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't seem that this, it hasn't been made a priority this Congress, and it doesn't seem likely that that will be the case in 2024, especially considering that there are currently bipartisan discussions in the Senate around border reforms, tying it with security funding for Ukraine and Israel. However, these discussions currently do not include a solution for dreamers. So with that, I will now hand it over to Jose to speak on the latest developments on the Farm Bill.
Thanks, Rosario. So if you were with us last year for NLS, you'll remember that we decided to venture into a new legislative world for us, and that is the world of the Farm Bill. This was as a response to many of our community colleges, particularly those community colleges that serve agricultural areas and have agricultural or energy efficient workforce programs in their catalog, seeing a need for additional federal investment in these programs. As a result, we've been working really closely over the past 12 months with other stakeholders, with other partners, and with our Senate and House partners in advancing some of our priorities around that area, as well as in other issues regarding student food insecurity, as well as workforce development for SNAP recipients, which is also governed by the Farm Bill. Just as a quick recap, the Farm Bill is very much like the Higher Education Act, is a federal law that governs most of the aspects around our agricultural industry, from farm subsidies to food and nutrition to workforce development and research around the agribusiness. So with that in mind, there is one big difference between the Farm Bill and many of our education-related federal laws, and that is that this is a bill that historically maintains a strong bipartisan focus and typically gets reauthorized in a very timely manner compared to some of our other bills that we follow. We haven't reauthorized the HA since 2008, so that's a prime example. The Farm Bill was last reauthorized in 2018, and it was set to expire last year. But given, as we've already mentioned, a lot of the complications with this Congress, with the razor-thin minorities, with the hyper-partisanship, and with a lot of ideological differences in the Farm Bill, specifically with the nutrition programs and the SNAP program. There's been they needed additional time to continue negotiating. So in the first continuing resolution that was passed at the end of September last fall, they extended the authorizations for all the Farm Bill programs for a year. So all these programs expire now in September, at the end of September of this year, giving lawmakers in both the House and the Senate additional time to continue negotiating. Just this week or this last week, we heard from senators in the Agriculture Committee planning to unveil their own version of the Farm Bill. The House has been the one taking the lead so far in a lot of those conversations, but the Senate Agriculture Committee plans to unveil their own version as their marker point to go into these negotiations. The differences within the SNAP program are still there, so that is probably the biggest challenge that's going to have to be overcome. But I think ultimately this is a bill that many, both Democrats and Republicans that represent rural districts care about. And so I think there is a strong likelihood that we could see this getting reauthorized before the end of this Congress. And so with that, we're going to work closely to ensure that our priorities within this bill are embedded into the larger vehicle as much as possible. I mentioned that we worked over the past year on providing additional federal resources to our community colleges that have workforce programs geared towards agribusiness and energy efficiency. That is what is known as the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act. We're working really closely with the office leads in the Senate and the House to advance, as well as some of our other partners, to advance this legislation. And in addition to that, we're generally speaking with offices across the aisle and with committee members to ensure that there are less barriers for students within our campus who are otherwise eligible for SNAP to receive that benefit. We know that food insecurity can be a huge obstacle to many of our students reaching completion and successfully completing, moving on to better paying jobs and getting economic self-sufficiency. So we want to ensure that there are not additional barriers, needless barriers, to them accessing the resources that they need. And along those lines, many of our colleges across the nation are serving as what we call SNAP employment and training providers. So we want to work with Congress to ensure that the federal program itself, is streamlined to better serve SNAP recipients and to help community colleges become SNAP ENT providers as well. So with that, I'll turn it over back to David.
Thanks, Jose. This is the last issue that we're going to discuss this afternoon before we take your questions. And it's one that in an ideal world, we would be dealing with within the context of a Higher Education Act reauthorization bill, because it's in the Higher Education Act, would be addressed through that. But as Jose said, the Congress hasn't reauthorized that bill for 16 years, and nobody is really willing to bet on when it might actually be done at this point. The issues are so complicated and so divisive. Having said that, as we talk about this very important issue of transparency and ways that accurate and usable and helpful data can be generated through the federal government, we should take note of the fact that more and more federal policy is focusing in on this general area, both in legislation and in regulation. And I would just remind viewers that the Department of Education is creating a new financial value transparency framework, is what they're calling it, that will take effect this July 1, in which institutions will begin to be required to upload a variety of data on their students to enable data on earnings and related aspects of student financing to be generated. That's being done at the regulatory level. So that's one important development. And then secondly, before I briefly mention where we are in terms of the Transparency Act, since it hasn't come up yet this afternoon, Dr. Virginia Fox, the chairman of the House Education and Workforce Committee, just introduced last week a bill called the College Cost Reduction Act that contains some elements of the Transparency Act that we're advocating on, even though it doesn't extend to students who do not receive Title IV aid. And that's the basic difference, or the biggest difference between what Dr. Fox is proposing and what's in the Transparency Act. So the Transparency Act, and some of you will be familiar with this, is a bill that would require the Department of Education to develop a data system that would include all students in post-secondary education, and would gather basic outcome data on those students, their completion, their postgraduate earnings, a little bit about their credit accumulation, and some of the basic demographic information that's already being collected. The advantage of this is pretty apparent to most policymakers and interest groups in higher education, that we still don't have, despite all the money that is invested in our higher education system and in our students, we still do not have a comprehensive data framework that can help institutions, students, policymakers, and all stakeholders best evaluate, how well programs are doing, how well they're serving students from the student perspective, which of course is the most important one, what program might lead to the outcomes that they're interested in, and so on. So we continue to push for this. Bills have been introduced in this Congress in both the House and the Senate, notably in the Senate by Ranking Member Dr. Bill Cassidy on the Senate Health Committee, who's a big champion of this legislation. So we ask you to advocate on behalf of this. We believe that in some ways, enactment of the Transparency Act would unlock in a lot of ways a lot of other good policies in the higher education and workforce education areas, because it would finally give us the data and the information that we need to really make optimal decisions about financing students and programs. So we supported this for a long time. Just as I mentioned in passing, this has got a lot of support both in Congress and outside it. You should know that Dr. Virginia Fox, despite what I mentioned just a moment ago, does not support the Comprehensive College Transparency Act, and that is to include all post-secondary students. Rather, she only wants legislation and then an emerging or possible data system to include Title IV recipients. So that's one of the differences on policy that we have. We think all students should be included in that system. So with that, I think we're ready to handle your questions. Carrie, are you gonna be the moderator there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, David. So I already have 3 questions in the queue. We'll just to give my colleagues a heads up, Jose will kick it off with a SNAP question. Then David, I'll ask you to take the one on the government shutdown, and then I will take the one on simplification. And so while we're going through those first 3, I invite the rest of our attendees, if you have any questions, please to start putting them in the chat box. And while you're thinking of those, I will also mention that our 1-pager for policy priorities that we call the green sheet, because it's always on green paper, is now live in the resources tab of the NOS website, nos.acct.org. Jose is going to put that link in the chat. So it'll be available to you. And I also see a question about a copy of the PowerPoint. We will have both the PowerPoint and the webinar recording up on the website, probably not today, but very soon, so that you can have this to refer back to. And we'll also be sending it back to all registrants, because we know that not everyone could join us live today. And we want to make sure that everyone will have them. All right. So with that, Jose, our first question, will all colleges be eligible for SNAP through the Farm Bill, or just rural colleges?
Thank you, Carrie. And I guess just to clarify, because there are a couple of different things that we are following on the Farm Bill, and maybe I was not clear with that. There's like 3 different things that we're looking at. On SNAP specifically, SNAP, as you may know, is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is the food subsidy that the federal government runs for anyone that is eligible based on income and other different requirements. That is eligible across the board for any student, regardless of whether they're in a rural community or a metropolitan community. It is more so on whether they are eligible based on employment and a couple of other things. The one challenge that we have that we're trying to simplify is that within the law as it currently exists, students that are enrolled in more than half time are automatically ineligible for SNAP to receive SNAP unless they meet one of like 13 very confusing exemptions. Those exemptions can be something like if you are a student parent with a child who is under 5 years old. And then there's also an exemption for if you are a student parent with a child that is over 12 years old, some things like that. And because of all the different exemptions and because of what's in statute, there's oftentimes a challenge with SNAP eligibility workers processing students' applications the right way. And so that's what we're trying to address there. The other angle that is on SNAP, which applies to colleges across the board, is SNAP employment and training, which is community colleges being able to provide supportive services and workforce education to SNAP recipients if they are working with their respective state's SNAP agency and contract with them to do so. That is also something that any college can really benefit from, and ACCT has an ongoing project around SNAP ENT. Highly encourage you to look into our website for more information on this. We're looking at streamlining that program and strengthening it so that it's easier for community colleges to be part of the SNAP employment and training program as workforce providers as well, workforce education providers as well. The one piece that is specific to more rural areas or perhaps for colleges that serve either agricultural areas or energy efficient industries is that bill that I mentioned, which is the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act. That one is similar to strengthening community college training grants in the sense that it's federal funds meant to upscale the workforce capacity, workforce education capacity of our institutions, but specifically in industries that relate to agriculture or energy efficiency.
Thank you, Jose. Next up, question for David. How will a possible government shutdown affect our ability to meet with policymakers?
Well, the good news, at last, some really good news. No, the good news is that, I mean, first of all, we don't think that there's going to be a government shutdown. We understand that there are some, high wire, as you heard, negotiations occurring over continuing funding for the government in the form of a continuing resolution. But we are hopeful that that will be provided. However, even if the individual agencies might not have their funding continued or provided, that the Congress itself will remain in operation. So it should not affect the your ability to meet with congressional offices.
Thank you, David. Next up, we have a question on FAFSA simplification and the ability to know in advance whether or not you are eligible for a Pell Grant. So just a reminder, kind of some background on this question. In 2019, Congress passed a law that allowed the IRS to directly share data with federal student aid for the processing of FAFSA applications, which meant that the kind of the bridge tool that was in place before that, the IRS data retrieval tool would no longer be necessary. And then at the end of 2020, in peak pandemic, as part of one of the large legislative packages, it included the FAFSA Simplification Act, which would reduce the number and complexity of the questions asked on the FAFSA, but would also expand the pathways by which someone could be eligible for a Pell Grant. So there could be their calculated eligibility, but also just based on their family size and adjusted gross income, they could be eligible for a minimum or maximum Pell Grant. The goal there was to really help students to understand even years in advance whether or not they might be eligible for a Pell Grant. So we are now here over 3 and 4 years later since those two bills were passed into law. And the department has finally released the first FAFSA form for the first aid cycle that actually uses this new formula and new format. For about the last 8 or so years, the FAFSA has become available on October 1 for the for the aid year that started the following fall. This year, the FAFSA was not released until New Year's Eve on the 31st. And for the first couple of weeks of January here, we've been in what the department has been calling a soft launch, where the form has not been available 24/7 as they ensure that it is properly functioning for students to complete because this has been a pretty substantial overhaul. So I think that the best thing I can say is that it is underway. There are expanded hours increasingly every day, and FSA has a schedule up for when the FAFSA will be open for completion, but they are still working on that form. And the biggest impact on the institutional side is that means that the ICER report, the individual student report that the federal student aid sends to then states and colleges to do financial aid packaging, will be available to institutions at best at the end of January, and depending on who you ask, possibly later. So that's causing a lot of delay in financial aid packaging. If you are really interested and want to learn more on this, one of our breakout sessions on Monday afternoon will be with representatives from the Department of Education, and they will talk about FAFSA, as well as that session will also include everything that's happening in the regulatory space, such as gainful employment. So if you are interested in any of those regulatory topics or topics that are really sitting with the department and the administration now rather than Congress, I encourage you to come to that Monday afternoon session. All right, we have a couple more questions here that have come in. That I didn't get to read in advance because I was talking, so now I'm skimming through them. One, I think on Workforce Pell, David, to your comment, love the optimism on possible movement on short-term Pell in the coming year, which is very important to us. But we've been hearing this for several years. Is there anything this year that makes you more optimistic?
Well, I mean, yes, yes, to the extent that we have more co-sponsors on the bills than we've had previously. We have a variety of different bills that have been introduced, and we have leadership in particularly the House that have talked about this. And frankly, the lobbying that our members have done over time has developed a stronger base of support. And I think there's growing awareness in our economy that we need to have, more workers educated for the jobs that we have now. Short-term Pell alone is not the answer to that, as everybody knows, but it would certainly help us meet the workforce skills gap that we have in the country. So there is real momentum behind this, and I think the other thing that should be pointed out that was Carrie mentioned is that we do have when you've got a bipartisan bill in the House, which we now have, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, where each side gives some important concessions to the other side. That's a sign of how serious members are about trying to move something. So in a Congress where we don't expect to see a lot accomplished, and there hasn't been, this is one area where things might get done. No, there are no guarantees. And we'll quickly add that one of the things that issues that, and Carrie highlighted this, that remains a sticking point between the House and the Senate, as best we could tell, and various members as well. It's not just as bifurcated as that, is over the issue of the inclusion of for-profit institutions. There are a number of prominent senators who are adamantly opposed to that. There are some Democrats in the House that are opposed to it as well. Until or unless we can persuade those members to agree to have for-profit institutions included in the program, we could have a real stumbling block in our way. Our position on that is that with guardrails would translate into very, very strict eligibility criteria for institutions to meet in order to qualify, that if a for-profit program can meet those, we don't have a particular problem with them becoming eligible. Yeah, we'd like it just to be open to our institutions, but if the political reality is that key players insist on having for-profits included, again, given the standards that would be contained, we don't think it's any reason to oppose the bills.
Thank you, David. So next up, how interested can we expect Congress to be in supporting colleges over all the various that I think there's a word missing here, that higher education delivers, and kind of asking, should we highlight our particular concern about student success and completion? Jose.
Thanks, Carrie. I think this is a good question, but it's also a question that is a little hard to answer because overall there is a strong liking to community colleges across the board. There's a bipartisan support of community colleges in Congress. And, it's all about messaging. When we talk to Democrats, they really love that we are open access institutions. They love that we serve predominantly low-income, first-generation students. We truly provide a door of opportunity for many. On the Republican side, they like that we are probably in some communities the primary workforce education provider, and that we are adaptive and we're quick and we're always trying to adjust to the market and work with employers and industries. And so there is a liking to us. It's more of a matter of where higher education as a whole stands in the pecking order of the priorities in Congress. We've talked about, there's a whole discussion around on taxes in Congress right now. There's a whole discussion around national security, border security, supporting other democracies like Ukraine and Israel and so forth. And so where does it fall in the pecking order? I think the best approach to it is, one, highlighting the strengths of your community college, like the different programs, the success rates, the success stories, and also bringing up those concerns about what is preventing you from amplifying that success across the board in the community. This is an election year. I think some of my colleagues mentioned how members will be very keen to meet with stakeholders and constituents, especially as the months get closer to election. So highlighting how your programs, how the federal resources going to your programs benefit constituents is always going to be a really good, strong messaging. But more so than anything is showcasing the value add to the community overall. But it is an uphill battle when it's not just let's make sure that community colleges have an interest, but where is higher education overall? And are there some negative views, not from the community college sector, juxtaposing that attention over the work that we're doing? So just trying to ensure that we stay front and center is why we are delighted to have you all here next month, and that we hope that it's not just a one time, but that you continue that conversation throughout the rest of the year.
I just wanted to add to and reinforce that final point that Jose just made, which is that we are at this moment particularly preferred as a sector of higher education in Washington, to a large extent because of the deep unpopularity and unhappiness of a lot of members of Congress with the universities. And you're all familiar with the recent hearing in the House Education Committee on responses to perceived anti-Semitic incidents on campuses with 3 presidents. And that antipathy towards universities and the perceived elite institutions is a very real thing. And higher education overall to the public has, lost some of its support. Community colleges, though, have retained support for the by and large. And we are a somewhat preferred sector. So we do have an opportunity just to communicate all the things that Jose just mentioned to members when you're in town, and you will receive a warmer welcome than some other types of institutions might. I mean, that's the reality of where higher education is perceived in Congress right now.
And before I forget, I'm going to make one final plug, and I think this is a great example of the standing of community colleges within this Congress, is that after a couple of years of dormancy, in part because of COVID and in part for some other reasons, the Community College Caucus has relaunched this Congress. We have official bipartisan co-chairs in the House. And if this is probably one quick, easy way to garner the strength of our sector as a whole. So when you meet with your lawmakers, especially if they're in the House, share with them that we do have a community college caucus and we'd love to have them join the caucus. We are planning to engage with the leads of the caucus in Congress very closely throughout this year to highlight the value add that our institutions bring to their communities. The caucus is being led by Congressman Courtney from Connecticut and Congressman Bilirakis from Florida. So we're really excited to have this back online.
Thank you both. I'm going to try to, we've got 2 minutes left, so speed read through the remaining questions. There's a question about DEI programs and having federal regulators suggest that colleges and universities need to be in compliance with certain requirements. I'd love to have this question asker follow up with either me or David to talk about this a little more. Certainly at ACCT, we have been following the state laws banning DEI programs very closely. It's something that our board DEI committee has continued to work on, but we have yet to see a real federal angle for influencing those state laws or states who are considering those laws. So on that front, would love to further that conversation. And there's also kind of comments about how do we get Congress to pass more bills? On one hand, the way Congress is designed, it's supposed to have a low percentage success rate. I would say 20 bills historically is a really, really low success rate. So we're looking for a happy medium here that they definitely didn't meet in year one, though, we wouldn't want to see too high of a success rate because then that would just be lots of new laws all the time and it would be very confusing. But on that front, I think illustrating what we have in common, where there's agreement, where there are, I think the best opportunities for success is when folks on both sides of the aisle agree on the problem and the big picture solution, and then really need to work out the details. That's what we're seeing in short-term Pell. I think for some of the tax issues, it's the same thing. In areas where they don't agree on what the problem is, it's very difficult for them to get on the same page for legislation that's proposing a solution. But I think if we can get them to focus on the areas where there is agreement and that they just need to work out the details, that's where we can, at least in the higher ed space, help them to be the most successful. And Rosario has reminded me that we have a reminder slide. So let's move there quickly. If your question didn't get answered, please reach out to us directly. You'll see the public policy at acct.org for all questions related to NLS or policy issues. Anything that comes in there, we will farm out across both the ACCT and the AACC staff to make sure that gets answered. If you have anyone on this webinar who's still debating coming to NLS, the link is up and we are still accepting registrations. Reminder, if you are new to advocacy or a new trustee, we have some training academies that are available as pre-conference sessions on the 4th. All additional resources, including the green sheet, can be found at that link, and we'll be sending the slides out. Again, that's nls.acct.org. And then after you complete your meetings, and we'll talk about this more at NLS, we encourage you to fill out our congressional contact form. This just helps us gauge the success of our event, but also know moving forward when our staff goes to visit the Hill, where institutions have been in touch. So with that, thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you for my colleagues from both AACC and ACCT for presenting with me today, and we look forward to seeing you in a few short weeks. Thanks.